On Sunday, we learned of the passing of former Rockets center and NBA legend Moses Malone at the age of 60. Joining us to reminisce a little about Moses is former Houston Post Rockets beat writer and friend of the show, Robert Falkoff. Robert covered the Rockets from 80 to 95, including the 80-81 season when Moses led the Rockets to their first NBA Finals in team history. Great to have you with us, Robert. It's hard to believe, but since you're not likely to remember Moses if you're under the age of 30, can you describe what kind of player Moses was to the younger audience?
Robert, first of all, great to be with you, but I wish it was under better circumstances. Moses was a relentless rebounder, first and foremost. I would equate him somewhat in that regard to Dennis Rodman, but a bigger body and a much better offensive game. But on the offensive glass, he just had no peer during his era. He just went after the ball. He knew where the ball was going to come off. He knew how to position his body to get the offensive rebound. He was just amazing in what he could do with second chance, third chances. And then, of course, he developed just jump shot. He had a great little, mid-range jumper, and he became a very proficient free throw shooter because when the ball would go into him, nobody could really stop him or block his shot. He would go in and a lot of times take the ball right at the defenders, and so he got to the foul line a lot, 8 to 10 times a game in his prime, and he became a very good free throw shooter. So a great player offensively, not a great passer, but he didn't really have to be, and I think he improved somewhat as he went along. But, his records, speak for themselves. 2 MVP years with the Rockets and then another one with Philadelphia when he was in his prime and led them to an NBA championship and helped them become one of the great teams of all time in 82-83.
It seemed like he was the guy that was really carrying that team in 81. Rudy was obviously on that team, Rudy Tomjanovich and Calvin Murphy. And both of those guys were integral parts of that team. But Moses was the guy, wasn't he, that carried that 80-81 team? What do you remember about that?
Well, yeah, first of all, he was the MVP a couple years before that when I think they had won something like 47 games. Then they got Rick Barry. They made a big splashy free agent signing with Rick Barry in 79-80, 78-79. Didn't quite get over the hump. 80-81 was one of the craziest years in NBA history because that team finished 40-42, but back in those days, the first round of the playoffs was a best of 3, and so they played the Lakers a best of 3, a great team. They were a prohibitive underdog in that series, but because Moses was so great, he gave them a chance in that series, and they wound up winning game 1 on the road. Then they lost game 2 at home, and everybody said, well, L.A. will go back to L.A. and they'll finish it in the third game. And in the third game, the Rockets were a gritty bunch. They developed a defensive mentality late in the year, had to struggle just to get into the playoffs, and then they had a great player in Moses, and they wound up pulling out that game. And then it was just off to the races. They beat San Antonio in a classic 7-game series. They beat the Kansas City Kings in the third round, went to the finals. And then, of course, Moses in the finals, after it was 2-2, nobody will ever really remember whether this was said in jest or exactly how it came about. But in order to fire up his team, he had a quote, I could take 4 guys off the streets of Petersburg, Virginia, which was his hometown. I could take 4 guys off the streets of Petersburg, Virginia, and beat the Celtics. And Bill Fitch was the Celtics coach at the time. He was known for scanning the newspapers at length to try to find bulletin board material, and so it didn't take long for that quote to get into the yellow highlighter category. That was up on the Celtics bulletin board when they got back to Boston for Game 5. And Boston was pretty fired up. They blew out the Rockets in 5, and then they ended up coming back to Houston, winning Game 6. But, as Moses said, hey, I was just trying to fire my guys up and make them believe we could go win. He had a great year, but even better year, the next year was 81-82. He had a month in February of 82 that was, and I remember writing this, it was Chamberlain-like, something like average like 37 points and 20 rebounds for the entire month. again, was the MVP. And then, of course, we got to the historic trade when the Rockets didn't have enough to put around him to win a championship. And at that time, money was a big issue because, the league hadn't become what it is today. A question in the organization was, could we keep Moses, who was going to command a really big salary, and have enough money to put the pieces around him, or trade him to Philadelphia? Philadelphia had Cleveland's number one draft pick, which was Cleveland was the worst team in the league, so they were going to possibly get Ralph Sampson. The Rockets wound up making that trade. It was Caldwell Jones and Cleveland's number one pick for Moses in a convoluted way. They did get Sampson. Didn't work the first year. The next year, though, they had the number one pick again. They got Olajuwon. And so Philadelphia won the championship in '83, but a decade later, because of the root of that trade, the Rockets wound up winning a championship. So it was sort of a win-win deal for both Philadelphia 76ers and the Rockets. And that Philly team he went to, of course, with Andrew Toney and Maurice Cheeks and Dr. J and Bobby Jones. I mean, they were ready to win. All they needed was a prolific offensive center, and he certainly gave that to them. And so they became one of the great teams of all time with Moses here in Philadelphia.
And in more ways than one, he was a big part of the reason why Hakeem Olajuwon was a Rocket, and as great as he was as a Rocket, not only because Olajuwon ended up with the Rockets partially because of that deal, but really Moses was the guy that helped Hakeem Olajuwon develop at those nights at Fondy Recreation Center, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Some of those legendary summer nights at Fondy when Hakeem was, a real thin guy, a defensive shot blocker, but didn't really have the offensive game. He went down and really toughened up in those Fondy games, and that helped him when he got to the NBA to handle the physical nature of the game and to become ultimately the player that he would become. And certainly Moses was a big part of that. He was just ahead of his time in what he could do offensively. You'll talk to some of the great shooters, Calvin and Rudy, and then he had a point guard when he came to the Rockets and Lucas. And, he made everybody so much better because he commanded the double team. And even though he wasn't a great passer, he became a better passer. And so he would get the ball out of the double team and got better and better. And then later on in '81, when they went to the finals, Robert Reed and Dunleavy were in there, and they were the recipient of him taking so much defensive pressure and creating open shots for them. And Moses was quite a guy. Didn't have a lot to say, wasn't a big interviewer really, just did his work on the court. When I started on the beat, my first year was 79-80, and George White was the Chronicle beat writer at the time, and I was with the Post. He didn't really know our names, and so he would just call us Post and Chronicle. So he would see me in the hall and, hey, Post, what's going on? Or he'd see George and he'd say, hey, Chronicle. So, he was short and to the point, and but a really good guy and one of the great players in NBA history for sure.
Definitely, you would say on the Mount Rushmore of Houston Rocket players of all time, he's definitely in that top four. Hakeem Olajuwon, of course, in that group as well, but Moses Malone definitely there, right? Oh,
definitely. Had he come along just a few years later, the NBA really exploded in popularity, I think, around 84. It was during the Celtics-Lakers '84 finals. Moses was, starting to go down a little bit at that time. I think he peaked in '83 and was still a great player for a few years after that, but started to go to the downside. He was so quick in his prime. Got a little bit chunkier, a little heavier, still a commanding presence, but didn't quite have the quickness. But had he come along 3 or 4 years later, I think he would be even more celebrated than he is. And he's still, of the people that were in that era, they know, how great a player he was.
Yeah, and unfortunately, he's not the only legendary NBA big guy that we've lost recently. Darryl Dawkins. You reminded me that Caldwell Jones just passed away less than a year ago. A couple of the former Trailblazers passed away when they were very young. Kevin Duckworth, another center, and Jerome Kersey as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of, very eerie because, of course, Caldwell Jones was involved in that trade when the Rockets traded Moses to Philadelphia. They got Caldwell Jones back. They already had Major Jones on the team, and I know Major and Moses Malone were real good friends. And, very sad to hear the passing of actually three centers that played in a relatively short period of time in Philadelphia with Caldwell Jones, Daryl Dawkins, and Moses Malone, all about the same age, passing away really within the calendar year of each other.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Robert. It's always a pleasure. And Moses Malone, one of the greats in Rockets history, he'll be missed and just a really great friend to so many of the Rockets past, too. And I saw just an outpouring of real heartfelt sorrow from those guys. It was good to reminisce with you about Moses.
Certainly was. He was one of the great figures in Houston sports history, and he'll be sadly missed, Robert.
You're listening to Houston Sports Talk.